This is a jump. And I hope, that at this point I don't have to prove to you that it is. I think I've made that pretty clear. So instead, let's go a little further. This is your jump, in a way that this was not. There's a level of ownership, a level of identity to this jump that basically the same movement in Titanfall just doesn't have. And I want to explain why. Let's talk about agency. Agency is, as I've mentioned previously, very much a complicated topic in video games because anytime it comes into play, it has to be an extremely layered question. So, for example, can a non-player character ever really have agency? In a book or a movie, the characters in the story can absolutely be interrogated along the lines of agency, but that becomes a lot harder to interrogate when they're placed next to a protagonist who is literally imbued with agency from beyond the fourth wall. It gets a lot harder to say that they can actually act on their own. How can we respect a scripted character when a non-scripted character, me, is charting my own path through the story however I please? But it doesn't stop there, because you can make the argument that I don't have true agency either. The player can't really have true agency, because that makes it really hard to write a story. In Skyrim, I can try to walk straight into Windhelm and kill Ulfric Stormcloak, but if I do, he'll just get back up no matter how many times I hit him, because the story can't go on without him. This is a pretty infamous problem in role-playing games particularly. Big fights where you'll dominate the whole time, and then the second the fight is finished and the game's story takes over, you'll lose anyway, no matter how well you did, because you need to for the story to progress. And the problem goes even further past that. I'm only using a keyboard to make inputs into a program that, by its very nature, cannot do anything that it has not been programmed to understand. Mass Effect doesn't let you retire and become a farmer instead of saving the galaxy from the Reapers, not even because of the plot so much as because there is only so much the game can be programmed to do. It's kind of an unspoken rule in games that true player freedom is by and large unachievable. You can approach it, but you can't ever actually reach it. So, looking back, does Titanfall actually offer us agency? Kind of. I should emphasize here that perfect agency isn't the goal, and frankly, doesn't even make for all that good of a work. So with that being said, Titanfall does what it sets out to do. It writes a good story in which the player gains a steadily increasing level of physical agency to overcome the challenges placed in front of them. However, the player doesn't have anywhere near that level of narrative agency. Despite your growing weight as a character, you can't change the story any. From start to finish, you could technically describe the game as just a single long hallway with twists and turns, but no exits. Every time you play the game, you'll be covering the same ground in the exact same way, no matter what you do. Or, to put it in another way, I guess, you have control over how you use your agency, but not what kind of agency it is. You can't choose what kind of superpowers you have. No matter how you feel going in, you'll come out as the nimble trickster hero who darts through the battlefield by means of speed and wit. You don't get to make that choice. No matter what, you'll always end up playing the character the game wants you to. And I'll emphasize again that that is not a bad thing. The game has a story it wants to tell, and that story cannot be told if the player has full agency. The end work is better for it. But it does raise the question. What happens when the game tries to let you loose?
Jet Set Radio!
Jet Set Radio is a game I love, but it is a very difficult game to describe. Maybe I should start by saying what it's not, because the game actively resists definition on a number of levels. The most obvious is the story. Titanfall is a masterfully placed sci-fi story, Celeste is a deeply insightful narrative about self-worth, and Spider-Man well deserves its reputation as one of the best adaptations of the character. Jet Set Radio, on the other hand?
Hey out there, this is Tokyo's very own #1 pirate power station, Jet Set Radio! Over the hood, through the streets, and right into your brain. We're transmitting our signal straight to you. Y'all got your antennas on or what? Yeah, we're riding high in a smooth stream of supersonic sound. And I'm your captain and DJ, Professor K. Jet Set Radio! Three gangs are fighting for the Tokyo streets. In the west, from Bentencho, the city of the night, we got those high-tech maniacs, those man machines, the noise tanks. And in the east, from Koganecho, the city of the sunset, it's that crazy monster mask wearing gang, Poison Jam. And from Shibuya-cho, in the south, the city of daylight, it's those troublemaking punks, the GGs.
Now that you're feeling
the GG's home turf, Shibuya-cho, was just attacked. Was it Poison Jam? They were talking about spreading out there. Or maybe it was the noise tank, trying to send a system crash through the whole city. Listen up, all you innocent fools out there. Officer Onishima has got some special order Kisatsu bracelets all ready for you. So, get yourselves to the bathroom and brush those teeth, boys and girls, because a whole load of trouble is heading your way.
And it only gets stranger in the story's second act.
That record everybody's looking for is already missing. According to some info we got from Poison Jam, it sounds like that record's the real thing. It was made by some freaky evil sound engineer, and it's been passed hand to hand all the way to Tokyo. Goji wants to use the record to make a contract with a demon so he can take over Tokyo and the rest of the world. If those guys get all the pieces, Tokyo, this radio station, sushi, ramen, hamburgers, and everything else are going to be history. Get to the new Rokuku headquarters and destroy that record, along with Goji's evil plans.
I'm not gonna explain that. I don't think I could, even if I tried. Actually, you know what? I don't think that even needs explaining. I think it was perfectly concise. I think I know exactly what's going on, and it's been very helpful. It's like, okay, this is a tangent, but we're talking about how ridiculous the game is, and I can't not include a trailer of the game that I came across in the research for this video, because I just...
We have everything you need to live the young, hip, jet grind radio lifestyle. You skate, you groove, you bomb bricks, and run from the man.
Jet grind radio on Dreamcast, Reality 14.
What? Huh? Who was this game marketed to? What was the demo they were going for here? Honestly, what was going on in 2000 in general? We're getting off track again. I'm sorry, it will happen again. So, the story isn't anything we can take seriously, or use to properly define the game. But if we can't really use the narrative to help parse the text, then where do we go next? Did you get it? Do you get where I'm going? Have you been paying attention? Because if you said we look at its gameplay, Jet Set Radio is already one step ahead of you, and that's incomprehensible too. Damn it! No, you still got it. You were on it, and I appreciate it, but to explain this a little more, I have to go on tangent number 2. Yeah, there are enough of these that I have to number them. Anyway, games rely a lot on inherited and translated knowledge that you bring in from other games. Part of it is just that you don't want to teach a player how to walk around for the 50th time, but it's also just more convenient, so they'll share mechanics whenever possible. For example, strategy games will usually use a technology tree to unlock more powerful options as games go on, or shooting a head will do more damage than shooting a body, so because these systems work, and players know to expect them, it speeds up the process of immersing them into a game. When I start up Titanfall, I'm not starting totally from zero, because I've played other first-person shooters before, and I already know that, say, I can damage myself but I can't shoot my teammates. This is actually a lot of the reason that genres are a bit stricter in video games than in other mediums, or I guess they have more of a defined meaning. In the space of video games, genres are generally associated with more specific gameplay mechanics, because that's usually more helpful in describing a game. So, for example, the broad category of horror exists, but it's split into smaller categories based on how the game plays. A survival horror game will scare you through depriving you of resources and keeping you from feeling safe, while a psychological horror game will scare more with its narrative than explicitly textual content. This sort of system works pretty well, emphasizing what you need to know before going into the game. The problem, and the reason any of this is relevant to us, is that Jet Set Radio doesn't do this. It doesn't really have a genre. Like, the closest thing it falls into is the space we vaguely call arcade games, which today refers to the descendants of classic arcade models that emphasize high scores and playing the same stages over and over again until you master them. Arcade is a big genre, though, and taken generously can be interpreted as basically any game that places gameplay above its narrative, so that doesn't tell us a whole lot. And every time we try to get more specific, the game shrugs us off. It's not an extreme sports game like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, because there aren't any buttons for doing tricks or anything, but it can't be a 3D platformer like Spyro, because there aren't the challenges in the level that you'd find in a platformer. But it can't even be a graffiti game, because while the game does let you make your own graffiti, it's stuck in a menu separated from the actual game. The game is extremely frustrating to stick a label on, because it doesn't feel like anything else I've ever played. Okay, tangent number 3. While I was doing research for this game, I came across an interview with the designers, which was really interesting, hearing the progress and how they apparently didn't have solid gameplay until much later in the development cycle, but they did actually give a game that was a major influence on the project, a game that inspired Jet Set Radio, and was one of the things that kicked off their development process in the first place. Frankly, everything I'd been looking for. That game was Parappa the Rapper? What?
Here we go. Check and turn the signals to the right. Check and turn the signals to the right. Now turn to the right. Now turn to the right. Check and turn the signals to the left. Check and turn the signals to the left. Now turn to the left. Now turn to the left.
Another source of inspiration was Ueda's visit to 1996's Tokyo Game Show. When I saw Parappa the Rapper at TGS, I think that's the first game with pop culture like that. They did it first. After that, I decided to make a true game, not just a visual experience, that was actually for adults. Honestly, I can see it. I hate that I can see it. I'm really unhappy with this newfound fact that I can see it, but I can definitely see it. You know what, though? Maybe Parappa the Rapper did actually give us something. The art style. Jet Set Radio has a distinct visual style that it commits to and pulls off, becoming instantly recognizable no matter how old it is. Despite the silly nature of all its characters, despite all the goofy art and weird proportions, it still feels like a cohesive world. And it's more than stood the test of time. As an example, Jet Set Radio came out in 2000, a year before the first Halo game. I mean, you tell me which one has aged better. Cell shading is honestly really good at this. Actually, you know what? Tangent number 4. Cell shading is so much cooler than anyone gives it credit for. It's my video, I get to geek out about visual art for a while. This sort of visual style is an effect called cell shading, named for animation cells from traditional hand-drawn animation, and it lets you make 3D models look like they're hand-drawn. It's a visual space that's in between 3D and 2D. It brings the versatility of 3D models to a 2D space. It's gotten more common in the last decade or so, but it's still pretty rare, and I don't know. This is a pretty common point surrounding cell shading, but it does really feel like the antithesis of the continual progress of modern graphics. AAA games tripping over themselves, trying to look more and more realistic and each outdo the graphics of the last, and I guess it's kind of nice to see games that push back against that and are okay with being stylized. And actually, a similar thing can be seen with the game's music. You may have noticed already, but I've changed things up a bit, and I've put some of the game's music in the background, because, put simply, there is no Jet Set Radio without Hideki Naganuma. Hideki Naganuma has remained a popular figure through to today, acting as a little bit of a micro-celebrity to people who are deep enough in video game spaces to actually know who he is, and his Twitter shitposting certainly doesn't hurt any, but, he's done the exact same thing for the last 2 decades, and that's because he's really goddamn good at it. Jet Set Radio sounds like Naganuma, and because of that, it sounds like absolutely nothing else. In the nearly 25 years since the game released, games that have sounded like Jet Set Radio have come out, but none have captured exactly what it has, and none have sounded exactly like it. It's more than just the music, though. It's also the implementation. Jet Set Radio does something that I've never actually seen before, at least not nearly at this level of commitment, and that's make the music independent of the player. Video game music is a really complicated form of music, and it's got a really interesting history and development, and I dearly wish I could justify giving it a video all to itself, but I'm already barely talking about jumps. We're getting back there, I swear. The thing that is perhaps most important to know about video game music is its intended implementation. It's similar to a film's soundtrack in a lot of ways, but the most important difference is that a composer for a film can play the books, so to speak, timing music to correspond with the events of the film. In a video game, though, player agency means you can never be sure how long a player can spend in a certain area, so basically all pieces of video game music are designed to be looped indefinitely. They'll be played on repeat, written so that they can repeat without the player noticing the loop, so that they can be repeated until the player leaves the context the music plays in. The game will loop in the background music for the area until you get to a fight, at which point the battle music starts, and then it goes back when the fight ends. There are more complex evolutions of the system that try to make it smoother and respond more to the player, but fortunately, we don't need to get into those, because Jet Set Radio ignores this design paradigm entirely. Instead of this looping structure, the tracks play until their end and then transition into the next, like playing your own playlist in the background instead of a traditional non-diegetic atmospheric music. It's really hard to describe this to someone who hasn't spent thousands of hours with the same selection of pieces on repeat, but it really does feel different in a way that's tough to put your finger on. It goes deeper than that, though, because only in looking back at my recorded footage did I realize that the game is doing more than just putting a playlist on repeat for you. Different songs will play in a different order in the stage, which means that more than a playlist, the game is mimicking a radio station. Professor K is mixing the background music for you live, over the hood, through the streets, and right into your brain. And live is absolutely the key word there. This technique gives the game an incredible sense of life, and brings it to life in a way that it wouldn't be otherwise. Jet Set Radio is considered to have one of the best soundtracks in gaming history, and it absolutely deserves it. So we've spent a while digressing into the fascinating nonsense that is Jet Set Radio, but I do think we actually have something here. Hear me out. Jet Set Radio is a queer game. It isn't queer in the sense of any specific identity, though. There are certainly plenty of games that are queer in narrative, but I think Jet Set Radio is queer in structure. Because queer the umbrella term isn't really about any one identity so much as it is a space for identities to exist within. Queer scholar Alexandra Doty defined queer as a flexible space for the expression of all aspects of a non-straight cultural production and reception. Or to put it another way, queerness is less an identity in and of itself than it is a space in which new identities can be formed. Remember the beginning, when we talked about Titanfall? While Titanfall's player identity was well thought out and compelling, it was hardly flexible. It wasn't yours, it was someone else's story that you got to play out. Queerness, in contrast, carves out a space free of pre-existing identity, and then lets you create your own identity within it. And we've already seen Jet Set Radio doing the first half of this, haven't we? The story refuses to let you take it seriously, delighting in its own nonsense and making you play along. The game doesn't play to genres, preventing you from bringing pre-existing knowledge and identities into the game. The art has a vibrant uniqueness that spits in the face of most games, and even the music shrugs off all conventions to state its own individuality. Everything about what the game isn't lines up. The game wants to deconstruct pre-existing identities coming into this textual space. So, what actually is Jet Set Radio? Jet Set Radio's gameplay is about painting graffiti. You're dropped into a stage with an objective, almost always to find and paint over a number of spots on the map indicated by red arrows. Get all of the tags before time runs out, and you get to move on. Completing stages pushes you forward in the story, but it also unlocks new places in the city and new characters. Character selection is an important part of Jet Set Radio's understanding of identity. When you first start a stage, the very first thing the game asks you is which character you want to play as. Even from the start of the game, you're prompted to choose between 3 characters who each have different ways of approaching the game. You see those bars off to the side? Those are what differentiate the characters. Power is basically health. Characters with more power will be able to take more damage. Technique gives you more points from tricks and movements and opens up new options to you. And finally, characters with high graffiti will be able to do more complex tags that give more points. Each character has a different level in each of these, meaning they each play in slightly different ways. The first 3 characters you get are pretty good all-rounders. Beat is okay at everything, Tab leans towards technique, and Gum leans towards graffiti. but they'll quickly get more specialized. For example, Piranha has high graffiti and power, meaning you can take a few more hits, but Yo-Yo has high graffiti and technique, meaning you'll get more points with slightly more risk. The trick is, you won't have access to all the game's characters right away. You'll need to unlock them by clearing stages, which will require getting better at the game and sometimes getting higher scores, which is where the trick of the points system comes in. I mentioned earlier that Jet Set Radio could be considered an arcade game, and this is why. Arcade games are the modern descendants of old cabinet games based around high scores, which use points systems to incentivize players to play in the ways in which the game works best. In Jet Set Radio, points come from either painting graffiti or doing tricks, and that leads to a fairly concise road along which the player develops. You start the game, having been stripped of context you normally have for the work. You use the 3 starter characters to learn the mechanics, slowly identifying which you like better. Then, shooting for higher scores, you focus more on the mechanics you like better, the ones that are more comfortable to you and that you're better at. Having done this, you then get an idea of which characters will be more your speed, and go through that process again, using the characters that fit the kind of gameplay you prefer, identifying which out of them you prefer to others, and coming out of it with a more concrete understanding of your own identity as a player. The game wants you to express yourself. It wants you to come to an understanding of your own identity as a player, and works that understanding into the scoring system, making it so that the best way to succeed is to understand who you are. It is the other half of our definition of queer. Once queer has created a space without pre-existing identities, it allows new identities to be formed. Jet Set Radio is a game about forming an identity for yourself, and that's at the core of what queerness is, so that makes it queer in my book. And for what it's worth, I think it is for Hideki Naganuma, too. And that brings us back to where we started. Remember our conversation about Titanfall? Back when you thought video games made sense, huh? Whereas Titanfall has an identity that it wants you to rise to fill, Jet Set Radio wants you to come to your own identity. It deliberately makes itself not, carving out a space independent of the notions about yourself that you bring in, and then teaches you to find an identity within it. It uses the player's agency and own inclinations to lead them to create their own game and their own fun. And I think that's why, even nearly 25 years after it was released, nothing has really eclipsed what Jet Set Radio was and is. Games have mimicked its style, mechanics, aesthetic, and music, but nothing has that final piece that made this game so special. And that's because the final piece was you. The game was built to reflect the player's identity, so of course nothing can come close to it. There is no one Jet Set Radio. There is only your Jet Set Radio.